Immunity by Kent J. Starrett. Read for you by the author. The very instant he turned 18, Timothy Driscoll Everett was going to move far, far away and never look back. Not during the day, not even midnight, but at 8:27 past morning, the exact instant in which, 18 long, long years ago, he had entered his life as the child of David and Phyllis Everett, hating virtually every single solitary conscious minute of it. He escaped, sure, but only in dreams. Tim had brief hours of tolerance, which were always separated by stretches of suffering hundreds of times as long. It didn't start with any particular precision. It had always been in him, and he suspected it lived inside everyone until society's demands said otherwise. The first conflict with his parents came when he was about 5. Even though as an adult he could barely recall it, it had been one of the most unsettling events in David's life since Tim had been born. Tim had gone outside to play, something David allowed within the confines of their fenced-off yard. Then Tim found a loose board in the fence and lodged it free, escaping, something David didn't allow. David wouldn't know this, as he and Phyllis naturally assumed Tim could never breach a 6-foot wooden fence with pointed tips. So confident was David of his handiwork that he never really bothered to check the foundations in the ground, to see if a bad rainstorm might damage the wood or dislodge any of the pickets. That was how Tim got out. The first time, at least. He pressed against the picket, pulling back and forth, up and down, with all the strength his little flipper-like arms would allow. Pushing with all his might and with what felt like Herculean strength, he wrenched the bottom part of the wooden plank up from the soil, falling backwards while still clutching it. With a short, high-pitched grunt, he picked himself up, tossed the plank aside, and tried to wedge himself through the fence. He found his shoulders too wide, so he turned himself on his side. With another short grunt, he squeezed his pot-bellied body through the opening. He had the mental image of himself as Spider-Man, wedging between a pair of buildings with supernatural stealth. When he emerged, he took in a vast new wilderness that, as far as he knew, had never existed up until just now. Outside the fence, he saw the world beyond his house for the first time. Sure, there had been daycare before, but that was confined, safe, and sterile. He had never seen anything like this. An open field of grass seemed to stretch as far as the orbit of Venus. The sun was now low on the horizon and casting impossibly long shadows from the trees, the bushes, and the one other house in his range of vision. He had seen the people who lived there, once, when they had come over for dinner. They had a girl twice as tall as him, who smiled a lot and made high-pitched noises in his general direction. She picked him up once. They had pasta that night. He ate it with his hands. Here, out in the open, he felt something he had never, ever felt before. It was like he'd found Wonderland, or Oz, or the Land of the Lost, a place he could never have imagined until then. He saw a cluster of butterflies off in the distance. They emerged out of a thick patch of grass in between a pair of pine trees. The wind was funneled between the two trees, and it seemed to be calling to him. So he answered. Tim set into a run to reach the grass, to burrow into it, be baptized in it. It was like being on another planet. Every sight was new. The blazing sun coming down on his skin, the bugs in the air and on his clothes, the rich fields of grass and trees between the other houses and his. He looked back and saw the loose board of his fence maybe 15 feet away and felt as if he were staring at a faraway desert island. And every feeling was new. He pushed his hands into the soft, damp soil, letting it swell between his fingers, this new substance like gold to him. Tim had never experienced it before, and he took it and threw it into the air, screaming in joy as it fell around and about him. Feeling something in his hair, Tim reached up to his scalp, hands still thick with mud and dirt. Something fluttered on his head and flew away, and he laughed because it tickled. It must have been another one of the stuggies, which was the word he invented just then to describe the insects. Laughing like he'd never laughed before, he knew then he would never, ever leave this magical place, this dirty, scummy world all his own. He was Max with the wild things, Tim, Emperor of Stuggies and Ick, which is what he'd just decided to call the dirt in his hands. His gibberish chanting, cobbled together from bits and pieces of a pop song his mother sometimes sang, and the theme song of a Saturday morning cartoon, inadvertently brought an end to his riches and his prosperous reign. His mother rushed out from beside their house, her panicked expression suddenly melting away into relieved laughter. The previous minute and a half had brought forth more unrelenting terror than she'd ever experienced in her prior 36 years of life. Her imagination had shown her a sideshow of bombastic horror as she saw her son killed or abducted for some billionaire's child pornography ring. She had just turned to an indescribably vivid picture of some teenage cult's child sacrifice when she saw Tim was, in fact, less than 20 feet away. When she saw him playing in a patch of muddy grass and yelling the kinds of nonsense comprehensible only to 4-year-olds, she nearly fell over cackling like a wicked witch on nitrous oxide. "Timothy!" she yelled, her voice breaking on another high-pitched laugh as she walked over to where he sat. "Tim, what have you done to yourself?" She picked him up and he smiled, his hair and face streaked in mud, shredded roots, and grasses. As he reached out with one of his stubby-fingered hands, she exploded laughing all anew, screaming, "No, stop, not in my hair!" and turning around to take him inside. As she did so, he reached out towards the wilderness, outside the house to which he was returning. As he saw the brave new world growing more and more distant, he started to cry, and if his mother were ever to recall this incident in the remaining half of her life, she would remember this as being the most upset he had ever been. It grew to the point where she almost, but not quite, felt it too. When David got home, Tim was all cleaned up and eating a piece of bread in front of the television. A mushy clump of it fell out of his mouth and to the floor. When he picked it up and shoveled it back in, his father lost it. "Tim!" he roared. "Don't eat off the floor! That's so disgusting!" Tim swallowed and looked at him, fear jumping around like a maniacal imp behind his glassy blue eyes. They had been unchanged since the day he was born, a baby's eyes on a baby's face. "Oh, knock that off, David," Phyllis called from the kitchen. "You should have seen him earlier. You'd have had a series of aneurysms." David sighed, running his hand through his clean, neatly cropped crew cut of gray-flecked black hair. He saw Tim do the same thing out of the corner of his eye, and smiled at him, even as the thought of breadcrumbs becoming stuck in his son's scalp irked him all anew. "What happened today?" he asked at the dinner table, after putting his suitcase and keys in their bedroom. He made sure the door was shut tight, so that Tim couldn't get in. She told him, and all throughout he looked something like Phyllis did when she first realized he was missing from their yard. She placed something edible down before him, and he didn't react to it. He was still shell-shocked. "Are you kidding me, Phyllis? He could have been killed! God knows what he's got crawling around in his system now from all those bugs out there. What if he has ticks? Fleas? I want him brought into the doctor's tomorrow immediately." "Why? Because our 4-year-old played in the dirt for 10 minutes? I'm serious, Phyllis. Lyme disease is a lifelong condition, born from guess what? Insect bites. They bite you, and in drawing blood, their saliva gets into your bloodstream and fills it up with all species of disease. He could be in very serious danger, Phyllis, and I— "Fine," she said, putting up her hands. "Take him to the doctor yourself, David. I did worse when I was a toddler, and I'm sure you did too. But if you insist upon having a nervous breakdown, then go ahead. Take him to the emergency room. I'll still be here when you come back down to reality." David growled under his breath and reached for a fork that wasn't there. When he saw the taco in front of him, he got up and went to the bathroom. "I'll be right back," he said. "I need to wash my hands." A commercial began on the television, and Tim finished chewing up his slice of bread. As he did so, he looked into the kitchen, where his father left for the bathroom. Odd. He'd never heard his mother laughing so wildly, or so much, in one day. Next time Tim felt as free as he had during his grand journey was when he was 12. A number of sojourns at summer camp yielded a similar feeling, but this time it went beyond that. So far, in fact, that he remembered why nature had called to him in the first place. Maybe he could have focused on it a little more if the others hadn't made it so difficult. As all the kids sat around the campfire and listened to scary stories, which were not scary and barely stories, he sat on a log with two other boys. They were discussing some card game about monsters. It seemed these only got more popular as he got older. And when they were done speaking, he'd ask if they knew anything about bats, or stick insects, or any of the things that occurred out here in the wilderness. "We're in the middle of a conversation here." "Sorry," he said, sharing his knowledge with no one. This wasn't uncommon. As a matter of fact, every attempt he'd ever made to connect with the rest of the human race had ended in similarly awkward disaster. He'd figured here he could find other people at least tangentially interested in nature, but most of the other boys seemed fixated upon proving their worth. Not that there was anything wrong with healthy competition, he just didn't see any point in it. He was on both the school's track and soccer teams, and part of the joy he experienced from both of these sports was practicing in the pouring rain. He used to get the most vicious colds, sometimes leaving him sick for weeks at a time. He often left the bathroom after vomiting like a plague victim for several minutes to see his father glaring at him from his parents' door. "Are you all right?" David asked through clenched teeth. "Fine," Tim said, reaching out to pat his father on the shoulder. His father always slammed the door before he could reach. Normal people, he'd decided by this point in his life, were unimaginably strange. Weird that they could even be called that, wasn't it? Normal. Tim supposed they must qualify as normal because there were simply so many of them, and whatever the majority favored was normal by default. At night, after the lights went down at the camp, the boys all traded stories of how deep they could swim, or how much they could lift, or how many girls they boned. They were such obvious liars, he almost burst out laughing, but it made no sense even to begin with. What did they accomplish? Some of them asked how deep he could swim. He said he'd never gone swimming before, and they all laughed, calling him a pussy. They asked how much he could lift, and he told them he'd never tried. Laughing harder, they asked if he was sure he didn't belong in the girls' cabin. They asked how many girls he boned, which is how he found out about the prevailing theory of the birds and the bees. He was angry, sure, and frustrated, but he knew if he showed it too much, it would only be worse. He held it in until they became distracted, and then slithered away to the lavatory. Outside, the rain drenched him. Tim had intended to cry it out, but the rain was just so overwhelming on the way there that he got distracted. The storm washed all the suffering away, his skin cleansed by a shower superior to any of the artificial ones humanity had yet invented. One of his father's rants had been about how filthy rainwater was, and Tim wondered if that was true. The rain answered. Everything from the preceding night was brushed away. The campers had been forced to apply sticky, itchy tick repellents all over themselves at the beginning. In the rain, it washed off, a suffocating skin shed like a serpent's. Tim could almost feel his pores opening, releasing toxins trapped in his epidermis for the 8 years since his great escape. This shirt was so stifling. It choked him like the embrace of a gigantic spider. He tugged at his collar, and when it didn't yield, he began to rip at it, buttons flying and cotton tearing. When it opened, the rain drenched him utterly, baptizing and purifying him, as the dirt had done all those years before. Why didn't everyone live like this? Off came his socks, leaving only the pajama bottoms he left the cabin in. Past the lavatory, there was nothing but darkness in the floodlight outside the cabin door. But there was no fear, only curiosity, nudging him gently forwards, like a mother eagle pushing its offspring from the nest. Advancing, the darkness embraced him. It, too, was cool, relaxing, purifying. He fell and tripped into the soil, cutting his arm on a sharp branch. A soft voice, perhaps belonging to his subconscious, urged him. "Leave it." Tim tried to plug the wound, and then the pain came, something like a hammer through the back of his skull. His hands found their way to his temples, and then it stopped, his wound left open, and the blood of his other hand smearing through his hair. Suddenly surging with adrenaline, he sprinted off into the night. The dark was so deep he could barely see, and many times he found himself slamming into trees and rocks. But he didn't stop. Each new bruise or cut felt invigorating, like pressure had been building up inside of him for longer than he had been alive. He ran further and further into the woods, and when he finally stopped, he may have cleared 5 miles or more. The rain had since ceased. Frogs, cicadas, and nocturnal animals sang his victory hymn. Tim felt something like pain in various parts of his body, but it was the kind of pain somebody felt after a vigorous fight or a strenuous exercise. It was like a runner's high, but it wasn't quite that either. There had been many times when he'd felt that before. It was like wonder, awe, but he'd felt that too, with science textbooks about the immeasurability of time and the formation of planets, stars, and universes. It was not that vast awe, though he imagined if a star could perceive itself, this is what it would feel over the billions of years as planets formed in its celestial cradle. It was this feeling of sheer naturalism, of fitting perfectly into something grand beyond oneself. Like being one with some god or another, he thought, as he collapsed laughing into the plants, mud, muck, and mire. He took up handfuls of wet earth and smeared it upon himself, into his open wounds. He covered himself in grass to heal his second skin, to facilitate the molting process, he thought. That sentence, to facilitate the molting process, brought upon such wild laughter he could hardly breathe, and he laughed himself almost to the point of asphyxiation. He languished there for God knows how long before he passed out in this all-loving womb of filth. They found him the next day, and he was interrogated by the police, insisting that he had no memory of how he'd gotten there. His parents followed up with a psychiatrist, who diagnosed him as a sleepwalker. He told the psychiatrist that sleepwalking used to be called noctambulism, and he laughed. It was the closest Tim ever felt to anyone. Dr. Saito, a friendly Amerasian man with a paternal disposition, prescribed him a medication to help him sleep more deeply. Tim pretended to take it every night therein, as he dreamt of the infinite peace he had experienced out there in the woods. Something had whispered to him, in that place where the wild and the vileness lived. It told him the divine secret, something that almost everyone who had ever lived had died without even being open to hearing, let alone obeying. And now it was lost. In his euphoria he'd forgotten, but he knew he could find it again. Away from all this suffocating civilization he was imprisoned in, like an animal in a cage too small. David didn't approve of any more outdoor activities for Tim, as he was convinced his son had caught something out in the woods that had driven him mad. Considering he never had sleepwalking episodes before or since that trip, it made sense. Eventually, though, his chains would rust and snap. Then, Tim would be free to follow his psychosis straight to hell or oblivion, if that was truly his destiny. I don't get it, Tim, David said to him over the phone. Okay, his son said back. Why are you doing this? His father asked. Can't you just... There was silence. Yes, his son asked. You didn't finish that sentence. We've been over this, he said, exasperated. Why can't you just go to college? What is it you want out of life? Don't you want more than just... whatever? Well, I don't know what whatever is, but I'm pretty sure I want more than that, and it isn't here, so I'm going to leave and go somewhere until I can find it. And find what? Can't you go to college somewhere else? Go to California or Seattle? Please just pursue an education. If you become an engineer or a doctor, you'll have all the money in the world, and then you can travel anywhere you want. Why do you have to do it now? Because I can, he said. And you've never given me any reason to do anything that didn't benefit you. You want a kid who's a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, and I don't want to do those things. I didn't belong in school, and I don't belong here. I want to go somewhere else until I find a place I can be happy, and if I can just do it now and skip all the shit you're talking about, I will. It's not your problem, is it? David heard a long sigh on the other end of the phone. Tim dug his nails into his palm, bit his tongue, looked at his watch, and saw it was 5:27. Almost there, he thought. Almost there. I just don't get it, son, David said on the other end of the phone. He was on some business trip, and he never came back well. Always drained, lifeless, and stressed out. More so than anything his father said or did, this was one thing that always assured him: he did not want his father's life. He was no more their child than he was of this world, or its people. Okay, Tim replied, hanging up as his father went off again. Tim hadn't completely surrendered on trying to connect to the human race. He'd tried. God knows he'd tried. When the opportunity presented itself, he went hiking, coming home caked in dirt and sweat, and driving his father raving mad. On the rare occasion he met others on the trail, there was almost no way to start a conversation, and when there was, those conversations went nowhere. In time, he came to learn that his fascination with truly exploring the natural world was intolerable to others. So he resigned himself to a life of meaningless small talk with the humans he had desperately tried, and miserably failed, to connect with. There were nature clubs at school, and though sometimes his knowledge of insects, worms, weeds, and other parasites and infestations were tolerated, they were never truly of value to anyone but himself. The entire species seemed determined to exile him, and all of these people were as foreign to him as if they were from another reality. Tim knew, then, at 15 years of age, that what he needed must be very, very far away from this place, from these confining, unnatural buildings, from these clean, shaven, perfumed, over-domesticated people who had chosen to be the equivalent of primate lapdogs. They were forever divorced from their true, organic selves. In a world of warm, dark, all-embracing life, it was blasphemy. How many nights had he snuck out to run laps around the neighborhood, bugs smacking against his forehead, through his hair and in his teeth? What about the animals? The coyotes, skunks, and deer who sometimes growled or charged at him. They were closer to what he needed, but not quite there yet. It wasn't here, and though he hated to turn back home when the time came, he knew his parents could easily have him recaptured and imprisoned. He thought about how many starscapes, sunsets, and hikes they had stolen from him, how many precious hours, minutes, seconds when he might have come closer to finding it before it slipped away. How many starscapes, sunsets, and hikes were stolen by the isolation, by the desire to turn to it, wherever and whatever it was, and share all this primeval beauty, only to find nothing there, nothing but silence and darkness and void. There were untapped wells of primal emotion to be stirred in him, ones the rest of his nominal species seemed to have forgotten in their relentless attempts to amputate themselves from nature. And though he didn't know what he needed, he had dim senses of it, what it should look like out of the corners of his eyes when he daydreamt or woke, what it should smell like, wet, damp, musty, what it should feel like, moist, soft, yielding yet feeding, like an absorbing amoeba. When he could walk or run no longer, he sometimes collapsed on the sidewalk or in the woods of the hiking trails. In those moments of deep, transcendent zen, it became so much clearer, as if it was right beside him. The reins of his own life weren't yet his, but as soon as he was 18, he could go hunting. That day he could have the rest of his life to search, to find the world, and maybe even the people from which he'd been severed by the curse of his birth. He would need money. Money for a car. Or no, a truck. One he could sleep in to avoid buying a motel room. He'd buy a truck, get the insurance, and just up and fucking go. Go as far away from this place as the wheels would carry him, and then walk until his feet were worn down to the bone. If he died trying to find it, it was better than spending the rest of his life dying anyway, and longing for something he would never have. So then, on that particular night as he sat panting beside a street lamp, Timothy Driscoll Everett realized the direction his life would be taking from the very second he turned 18 onwards. He would mark it down to the very minute, and then he would go, and he would never, ever look back. He felt something then, in the wind, something brushing against him, warm and wet and fetid. He thought he could hear something whispering to him. "Where is your life?" "Not here," he said. "Not here." Sickness is not to be feared. Sterility is. And on that night, with nature all around him, Tim Everett was not afraid. David had a very specific set of rituals that he undertook every day in preparation for his excursions into the outside world. First, David brushed his teeth, gently so as not to aggravate his gums. Then he flossed even more gently, ensuring all his teeth were still straight and still there. Mr. Everett clipped his nails, filing them down and cleaning the beds with a blunt-edged tool that he soaked in salt water and wound wash. Then he washed his hair twice and conditioned it every other day, going over it in the shower with a brush. Following this, he exfoliated his entire surface of skin with a loofah and a moisturizer. He used to use soap each shower until he read a study that indicated this is bad for the pores. Now, he did it only once every 3 showers, and on some days he could almost feel the oils of his skin pooling there in the outer layers of his hide. Every week, on Saturday morning, Mr. Everett shaved his whole body. Everything. There were microscopic mites that clung to the body hairs, who ate dead skin cells and fucked and shit all over your epidermis in their invisible hordes. The only way he could convince himself that he was clear of these omnipresent gremlins was to shave all the hair off his body. On the day he began to go bald, he thanked the God he believed in only when convenient that he could now have an excuse to shave his head. Now if only he could find some excuse to get rid of those mite-ridden eyebrows. At the current moment, however, he was very angry. Angry he had to go home from his business trip early to try and talk sense into this insane son of his. He'd spent a great deal of work behind desks, conquering mountains of paperwork, working hard to become somebody who braved the corporate world with a solid handshake and an assuring smile. A man who made people comfortable for a living, and not just to get into their wallets, but because he genuinely liked it. He liked sales pitches and meetings. He liked impressing people with beautiful investment plans that would help them grow their financial adventures to heights they'd never dreamed. All the adventure he needed was in office buildings, and he got his fill of it and more. If only Tim could see what he saw in the world. He didn't know where he went wrong, what gift he didn't give, or what trauma he'd inflicted. But not only did Tim reject school and employment beyond menial labor, he insisted upon getting so dirty, spending so much time out in the woods, living in sin worse than Vegas or Sodom combined. David watched him get bruises and scrapes and just leave them open, refusing any antiseptics. He let them fester, letting the bacteria rot in his skin. There were people who could refuse medical treatment for religious reasons, and whatever his reasons were, they were as important to him as any of this world's possible gods. As a very, very young boy, Tim collected insects and spiders and worms, digging in the backyard for them. David tolerated this, at Phyllis's behest, until he found a huge, coiled millipede in his shower, and cried hysterically, This was the closest he had come in his entire life to a genuine nervous breakdown. He put a stop to insect collecting and hiking and leaving the house for any reason after that. David wondered if maybe he should have just let Tim go completely wild. Then he might have gotten it out of his system, moved on, and become something valued to society. As he pulled into the driveway, he wondered if maybe he should have had another kid. Mr. Everett got out of his immaculately clean Honda, seeing he'd parked too close to his son's desiccated shell of a truck. He wished he could park in the street in front of Tim's vehicle to blockade him from escaping, but the crazy bastard would probably ram him. And from the size of that thing, he could probably bore his car in two. "Tim, can we talk?" David said, looking at his son. "Sure," his son said, looking at him and shrugging his shoulders. Tim had grown to have some of his father's face. Quite a bit of it, actually. His eyes were Phyllis's green, but they had David's shape, round, slightly oval. He had David's forehead, chin, and height, 6'6", though his son had more youthful muscle than he ever did. David thought, for 1/100th of a second, that maybe his son's outdoorsy lifestyle contributed to his swimmer's build, and then banished the thought in disgusted frustration. Tim's greasy, uncombed hair, sunken eyes, and dark, sunburnt skin, his unbandaged cuts and bruises. These were not the traits of any healthy human being. His hair would have been the color of gold, like his precious, if short-sighted wife, if not for the sheen. He felt almost as if his son were doing this to Phyllis, forcing the lethargic squalor on her, and he was flushed with another wave of confounded frustration. He wasn't quite old enough to have a beard yet, but he had a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. David had one in college, something he thought made him look like Snake Plissken. He let it run its course and figured, again, that he should have just let his son's obsession with the outdoors run its course, so that it wouldn't have come to this. Tim took out a cigar and lit it up, his father grimacing and waving his hands in front of his face. Timothy said nothing. "Where do you think you're gonna go?" "Somewhere," Tim said, not taking the cigar out of his mouth. His father caught the smoke and choked like his lungs had been scorched with magma. "Well, what do you think you're gonna do?" he asked, seeking some sense of reason in the boy. "Do you think you're employable? Do you think anyone's gonna hire you without anything? Without even a GED? You didn't even graduate high school." "Gotcha." Tim took the cigar out, spat on the ground, and watched his father cringe. He took another deep drag on it and scratched his hair. David put his head in his hands, growled, "Is this what you want? To be homeless? To be a fucking vagabond? You don't have to do this. What is it that's out there that I can't give you? That school can't give you? Isn't there a field biology class you can take or something? Can you become a park ranger? A zoologist? A fucking gardener? What could be out there that isn't in here?" "Everything," Tim said, looking at his watch. The sun was setting now, and kids were coming down the street with their bikes, laughing and yelling. There's a whole world out there. I want to go somewhere I've never been, see stuff nobody's ever seen. I'll do it until I find whatever I want, and then I'll get back to you." David sighed, and Phyllis came out to greet him. "Any luck?" Phyllis asked, not even acknowledging Tim's presence. Her husband's expression said it all. Phyllis was struck then by how similar they looked. Give or take 10 years to one of them, tan David or de-tan Tim, add or subtract one's hair, and she could almost believe they were brothers. She put her fingers up to her cheeks to prevent sobbing again. "I don't know why you guys are so upset. You knew I was going to leave eventually. Everyone does. I know there's something out there. I know there's people out there. I never felt like I belonged here or anywhere near here. No one understands what I have to say. There's no one to talk to, and I don't want to sit around all day wishing I could be somewhere else. There's somewhere out there that I belong. I can feel it in my... I don't know. If what I live for isn't what you're okay with, I'll find a way to make peace with that." He put his hands on his mother's shoulders, and then she did cry. His hands were dark and scarred from fishing through thorn bushes when they got caught on his meager clothes, from handling rocks and animals, from clutching through trees and dirt. The scars, discolored from infection, David knew all too well. His clothes were always the same, worn and torn cargo shorts, tank tops and jackets that kept him safe all through the years of Tim's explorations. To see his son hugging his wife made David sick. God only knows where he'd been. She cried and hugged him back, and when she was done, she went inside and said nothing. Timothy turned to his father. "Don't even fucking think about it, kid." David laughed underneath the plague doctor's eyes. Tim laughed himself, showing yellow teeth. Yellow, as it happens, is the natural color of teeth. Tim found this out through a socially awkward science teacher he'd had in his final year of high school, when he was 16. White teeth are the product of damaging acids in toothpaste, mouthwashes, and other unnatural artificial remedies. "Take care of yourself," David said. It seemed like the most painfully ironic thing he could think of at that given moment, but Tim just smiled. "We still have time," he said, holding up his watch. 8:20. 7 minutes. "You sure you don't want to hit traffic?" "There's never any traffic at night," he said. "One of the benefits." "Okay, son." The breeze flowed over him, and he heard something in the distance. "Where are you?" Tim heard it as clearly as if he had spoken the words himself. To everyone else, it would have sounded like any other summer breeze. To everyone else, it did not call. Maybe he was insane. Maybe he was truly mad with something the doctors couldn't find. But if the thing he needed was just a result of madness, and pursuing it was madder still, then sanity was prison from which he needed to escape, at all costs necessary. Sometimes night is oppressive, a drowning blackness that swallows all hope, meaning, and everything. Sometimes night is soothing, soft and gentle, rocking us all away into a slumber, which itself rocks us away to a land where the impossible becomes, for only a moment or so, as real as we think ourselves. Eternity becomes only a few seconds, and a few seconds become eternity. Everything we fear and want to run to and from is given brief, vivid life. And sometimes night is freeing. Sometimes the moon shines a light that sets the whole world ablaze, and the stars seem to speak, singing to you and you alone, from across a void so immense that it should be uncrossable. And yet, in defiance of the immeasurable isolation, sing they do. In time, the Everetts relaxed. After a socially acceptable grieving period, they began to think of their son as dead. While this is trying indeed, it can be overcome. "Some people have children who grow up and go on shooting sprees nowadays," Phyllis usually said, masking a longing for contact with their only child. She'd grown past the fantasy that he might, someday, turn his life around in return. David, the hair of his eyebrows now gray, had not. He brought it up the most. Though of course it crossed Phyllis's mind, she accepted it. Eventually. She longed to see him again with that same overbearing, clinging attachment that all functional mothers have. But she accepted what he was, on at least a subconscious level. David had other ideas. Did Tim just have a pathological hatred of authority? He didn't think he was a terribly confining parent. He enforced the most basal levels of adult functioning, didn't he? It was his understanding that people have worked, gotten married, had kids, and aged into well-deserved rest for a solid 10,000 years or so. It worked. We did it so that we wouldn't have to live like animals, like some people of this world still did, in more primitive places. Lifespans had tripled in duration. Infant mortality was near 0%. Sickness, troubling though it was to him, was treatable. Even if viruses and infections were made stronger by inoculation, the common cold was no longer a death sentence. Mr. Everett supposed, and vocalized to his full-hearted and empty-headed wife, that the hunger for wild surroundings just hadn't been bred out of the human race yet. Timothy Everett must have had some recessive throwback, something that made him yearn for the outside world, like a zoo animal. He asked if anyone in her family was like that, and after rolling her eyes in thought, she remembered that her great-grandparents were farmers in Scotland. Her great-grandfather apparently died of hypothermia in Loch Morar, searching for one of those folkloric water monsters Scotland was so well known for. "Oh, great," David said, imagining his son's drowned body washing up on the shores of Lake Champlain. Then he laughed to himself, imagining his son locked in epic combat with the lake monster, like Conan the Barbarian. It's bad enough he might be looking for monsters. What'll he do if he finds one? When Tim reached the sea, he didn't know what to do. He didn't have the money for a boat, at least not one he could survive a trip to Europe in. He didn't even know if what he sought was in Europe, so what good was it to go across the sea when he could just stay here? He needed a direction, he figured. North or south. He'd gone swimming to try and figure it out. As he sat on the shores of Charlestown Beach in Rhode Island, he watched the sun go down, thinking of what he'd done wrong and what he'd done right. Tim decided those words meant nothing, and that he would simply do until he was done with, as the saying went. The wind blew sand up the dunes, and he watched children emerge from the waves with their parents. A sandcastle, fit for a king crab, lost one of its towers as a tanned grandfather helped his stubby-legged little children pick up their things. The little girl waddled after a red, plastic bucket that the wind was rolling away. Tim caught the bucket by its cyan handle with his pinky finger and held it out to the girl as she approached with an open-mouthed smile. She had no front or bottom teeth.
"Thank you, mister,"
she said in a high-pitched voice. "Don't mention it." He watched her take it away, brownish-blonde ponytail whipped about in the wind. The elder waved his gratitude, and the greasy-haired boy next to him waved with both arms. Tim did the same, and began to walk off to his truck. He washed himself in the public showers, something it is very dangerous to do without sandals on. Grimy, filthy places all. He cherished his time there, lost under the steaming water. Looking down, he saw his feet were thoroughly calloused, the deep cracks not even coming close to his true skin. Some of the cuts he'd undertaken during his endeavors had ceased to be discolored, even if they'd scarred over badly. He'd built up his defenses to the point that pain was rare, even when his skin was broken. He often fiddled with the openings, meddling until they were scarred, and left his torso a labyrinth of valleys, craters, and mountain ridges. Where scars crossed, he thought of the Nazca lines in Peru, and smiled impishly. Tim dried himself with a towel. As he did so, he caught a piece of graffiti in the walls. It was etched in and around waist height, drawn with the crude charm of a child's handiwork.
"Life is a joyous thing with maggots at the center,"
it said. He knelt down, putting the towel over his shoulder. There was a chill from one of the cracked roof windows, so he did not stay long. But briefly he put his fingertips to the white wall tiles and ran them across the surface, as if he were touching a kindred spirit's disfigured flesh. "Life is a joyous thing with maggots at the center," he said out loud, and giggled. It was the happiest he'd felt in a long time. He wrapped himself up and went back to his truck, changing out of the swim trunks he had in the back, and preparing to sleep. The sleeping bag had become confining, so he'd started sleeping on top of it, under a dirty army blanket he'd bought at a thrift shop. Tim wondered what kind of child would carve that into a tiled wall. He wondered what type of man the boy would grow up to be, how he got along with his parents as the years went on. Did he get along with his parents? He hoped he did. And he hoped that, if he didn't, he met him someday. Met him and told him his words were just lovely, and that he completely agreed. Life is joyous and full of maggots. It's part of what gives life its healthy glow, he thought, drifting away into a warm, peaceful slumber as a strong wind beat down against the metal shell of the truck he called home. In the morning, he decided to head south. He knew what he was searching for was warm, dark, and wet, just like the places to which he had always been drawn. Whether he was looking for a place or a person, he couldn't rest, for it was calling to him, always. After you retire, it becomes necessary to find good use of your time. Most people are swallowed by the sheer nothing, the hours of news and talk shows, the endless leisure showers and coats upon coats of paint one can put on the outside and inside of a house, apartment, or tool shed. In the past year or so, Phyllis had seen David getting better, though he still wasn't quite his former self. They'd cleared out Tim's room. It was more difficult than they thought it would be, considering his only belongings had been books on nature and wildlife, medical textbooks fit for doctors and surgeons, and sheets in the corner. They'd insisted on a bed, and it was as pristine and untouched as the day they brought it home. Timothy always slept on the floor, and David had insisted upon cleaning the floor with his gloves. Now it was a guest bedroom, which would be just lovely if they ever had any guests. David's brother hated him, Phyllis's sister was dead. Phyllis's parents were across the pond, communicating only every few months or so by mail. Phyllis thought it better that way. David's obsessive cleaning was only just starting to brush against the limits of unhealthiness, even if it gave him something to do. He cleaned the kitchen floors. Not on any schedule, but just when he felt it needed to be done. It wouldn't be so bad if David didn't feel it needed to be done at least 3 times a week. She counted. The sink was always empty. That, she supposed, was fortunate. Some wives did housework their entire lives, or until they wound up screaming at their dead relatives in retirement homes. Cooking was the only thing she was still able to do unimpeded. The dishes were always done immediately after they were finished eating. She supposed David could read something in a medical journal that might someday lead him to demand to prepare his own food. For now, however, the house was an immaculate palace of cleanliness, a sight of such sheer spotlessness, it was almost unreal. If only they had more friends to bring over, she thought as she flipped through the channels. Part of his compulsive cleaning had resulted in removing a great deal of pictures of Tim. Not that he'd been a particularly picturely person to begin with, but the only photograph they had kept was a school picture, taken when he was 12. His expression was one of bland discomfort, blonde hair parted in the center, and youthful freckles still clinging to his forehead for dear life. There were other pictures of him, up in the attic. Almost none of them were of his teenage years, and she knew for a fact that he was 15 when the very last picture of him had been taken. After that, he'd been unreceptive to anything but his long sojourns in the woods, so a photograph would only portray the sides of his personality that they'd spent their last years together trying to ignore. She wondered, sometimes, if David was suppressing Tim's loss under all this compulsive enforcement of hygiene. Then she decided that she'd suffered enough for one life, and went back to watching TV. Tim stayed with the truck for almost a week after it crashed, besides the muddy dirt road that led through acres and acres of swampland. He'd bought a gun up in North Carolina, and since then he'd hunted where the option was available. In the South, they were more lax about this. He shot rabbits and birds, and ate their meat over a fire besides the dirt road. He'd seen only 2 vehicles pass by in those 7 days, and they didn't show any signs of stopping. Tim didn't cook his kills all the way. Hunger was too great, and the judgments of civilization too far away. He figured he needed to stop anyways, as he had reached as far south as he was going to reach. Soon, he would have to curve upwards, and then decide whether to head further south into Mexico or out west. Insects were thick in the Floridian darkness. Sometimes they landed on his kill as he ate, and they soon found themselves eaten. He was trying to build up a taste for raw meat, something people must have eaten long before civilization began. Tim made a point of snapping the bones open to drink the rich, syrupy marrow, and if anything was left, he threw it to the woods around him. "Life is a joyous thing with maggots at its center," he yelled, and it was only fair to throw some life back to the maggots. Tim was drenched in sweat. Always. He could feel it on his skin, hardening, soaking. It was becoming like a second, better defense. The sunburn peeled his hide endlessly, and in the places where it had not been scarified, he let it. It was in this state of delirium, in the back of his truck on one hot Everglade evening, that it spoke to him directly. Its voice was everything in the darkness, with only the sounds of the thick, swampy forest around him to underscore it. The man who had once been called Timothy Everett could see nothing and feel very little, and he could not know where it was coming from. Perhaps it was inside him.
Their world is an echo chamber into which they scream nothing.
It whispered at him with such hate, he felt like it was spitting on him. He caught breath of decay and covered his nose and mouth, eyes watering. Somewhere in its dry, ancient voice, he knew it was grinning.
You know it as I do. Their world is cold and desolate and infertile. The one to which you belong. The real world is warm and wet and alive.
One who shuns sunlight is some kind of monster to be escaped from, or shouted down until he either dies or is abhorrent no longer. One who spends his time with the rocks and the trees is an invalid, a person taking the easy way out, where the rest of the real adults work hard to keep society anchored and functional. That the ways of normal humans might be flawed or unhealthy would be inconceivable to those who hold up their cities on their backs, never reaching beyond the goals they were taught they wanted to achieve. His every struggle to join that world had failed miserably and left him alone with nobody to accompany him but long, hard nights of thoughts best left unthought and his own crying terror. That was why he fled, to get away from a world that had no place for him. He wanted to love this being that had called him, because this being might love him.
Your home is here. Your immunity near Zenith. You are a disciple of disease, an oracle of obscenity. You have earned the call, which so few ever find themselves hearing. Fewer still seek it out, seeking something richer and deeper than the crushing wheel of civilized life.
He heard a sound from another direction, like a child's laughter.
Civilized. What madness.
The child's voice said. The first voice started up again.
You are so close. So close. I can feel your skin on mine. Rich with all the beautiful senses and tastes of decay. Yet you do not die. the splendid source from which all life grows. We are so close, you and I. So close.
He sat up. He was back in agony. His eyes watered like rain clouds drenching his face. His mouth was dry, his limbs were numb, and his heart raced like it never had before.
We are here. But where are you?
Tim mustered what strength he had and forced open the back of the truck, the moist air of the swamp all around him, flowing like a gust of wind from the deepest pits of hell. Stepping out, he struggled to balance as his calloused feet sank into the mud. Looking nowhere in particular, Tim Driscoll Everett started to run. David and Phyllis were notified of his disappearance through a police officer from Florida. He'd called them with a license plate number, and Phyllis confirmed that it was indeed his truck. With soothing tones, the police officer said it had been found, rusted and seemingly abandoned for months. All of the belongings it might once have held, gone. No keys, no license, no registration, gone. They would have gone through a sweep of the woods, but the winter rains had come down and made the swampland almost totally impenetrable. They would have to try again shortly, but there were only two places he might have gone. He might have gone up the road and tried to hitchhike, reaching the nearest town, or he could have entered the swamps, in which case he was almost certainly dead, swallowed by the myriad predatory animals and incalculable diseases that bred in these places. Because David and Phyllis knew their son, they wept more viciously than they ever had before in their entire lives. Tim saw the shack through a haze of insects, bats, and mossy vines. He had slipped and fallen and wounded himself multiple times, but it meant nothing to him. His immunity had become so powerful that death itself was as something imaginary. Seeing the shack, rotted and blackened by mold and moist winds, he knew that he was upon the gates to supremacy. The door opened so easily. Tim felt the soft wood yielding beneath his weakened arms. He did not notice the words carved into the door, barely visible through the chipped paint and moldy cedar, though he would have recognized them and rejoiced if he had. The rusted knob cut his fingers, which barely registered out of the furthest range of his sensory perception. He stumbled in and shut the door, leaning on it. It bent against his back and creaked in agony, yet it held. He could feel cobwebs disturbed by the gusts of air when the door shut, and let them fall on his dirty, cut-up skin. Broken windows let in only the faintest light from the thick darkness outside, with insects of 1,000 genera drifting in and out at whim. Crawling over to a corner, he cried hysterically, sucking scummy, opaque rainwater out of a corner where it had pooled. He cried as hysterically as his parents would when they found out he was missing. He cried and felt the anguish of his entire life, all of the years he had spent searching for the place he belonged. In the night, the rain came down and the insects dispersed. Unclean water trickled down in rivulets and pooled where Tim was, and he felt its infinite viruses and bacteria invade his open wounds and change him, as it had countless times before he had come to this place. This place where he would cease to be and become something else. In the soft, damp darkness, new eyes came to watch him. Tim shook violently, wearing only tattered shorts as a cold fever overtook his whole body, Sweat and rainwater mixed on his oily, damaged skin. Shaking until he could shake no more, his senses cleared enough that he could see and smell other things in the shack with him.
There he is.
And he saw one of the things point at him with glittering, wondrous eyes. One of the figures nodded. Tim saw only outlines, vague things of shadow at the other corners of the shack. Rising slightly, he heard a rasping laughter, like the laughter of a jaguar.
Take your time.
He realized it was the same voice as before, this one, and the child.
Life has been too unkind to you.
The third one was new. It spoke with the voice of somebody drowning, yet not upset with this state of affairs, as if drowning to this thing was not fatal. Sitting up, Tim assumed the cross-legged position he had been meditating in so many times before. He dropped his hands and looked at them, his eyes adapting to the darkness. His vision was foggy, wet, and crusty, but years of exposure to these conditions made his sights as sharp as the hawk's.
That's it. It doesn't hurt you anymore.
Yes, this was the voice that had spoken to him, the one besides the child. Its mother? He couldn't tell. She was so tall she touched the top of the shack's ceiling, all 10 feet up. Her hair was matted and dreadlocked, reaching all the way down to the ground. It was stained with dirt, blood, and mites, knotted with seaweed, pine needles, animal claws, bird feathers, and other things he could not identify. It swung back and forth, gently. Things of waste and biological trash it must have taken longer than all history to collect. Something he saw she wore with pride as he looked into her blue, glistening eyes. Her face was angular, Aryan. Her skin the off-blue of a wind-blown frozen corpse. She moved stiffly. The ends of her unnaturally long limbs were blackened with frostbite, as were her lips and eyelids. In one of her ebon claws, she held a gnarled staff of twisted, white wood. When he focused hard enough, he could see faded tattoos of some kind running up and down her limbs. Simple horses, warriors, serpents. Viking, Celtic, Gaelic. Perhaps some ancient predecessor from which all 3 of those may have been descendants.
Take your time. There will be years without count, or number to take now.
He focused on that one, and saw a man of a little under 6 feet. The man's skin was wrinkled further than any living person's could be, a dull grayish brown. His eyes, if there were any eyes in their sockets, were squinted so tightly that either the eyes or the empty sockets were barely visible. Curly hair, shiny with grease, came from the sides of his head and over his ears. Rags covered his skeletal limbs and torso, marked with strange geometric symbols. A smell of thick rainwater came from his direction, and Tim had the idea that, even in the driest deserts, this man was always soaked in water. He had survived some kind of flood that had invaded his very being.
Do you think he's the one?
The woman asked. He caught a hard consonant inflection, something like a North European accent, in a delivery.
Yes. None of them in Strickland rank could survive this far. Survive such damage to the shell. He heard you, Scotty. He heard us.
Tim tried to speak, but no words came to him.
He's in pain still,
Said the child.
Yes,
Said the giantess. She reached a stiff obsidian claw out to stroke the child's hair.
He is in a way younger than you are.
The child laughed, high-pitched, grating, inhuman. He looked and saw the child was sleek for somebody no older than 8, and of the 3 of them the child was the hardest to see. It stepped closer, and Tim saw it more clearly. Its scalp was almost bare, but the bone of it was ashen, dark and gray. The skin of its arms and legs were cracked and stiff, like the plates of a crocodile. Tim caught the smell of burning flesh, something anyone can recognize instinctively if ever forced into its proximity. Beneath its cracked and fire-blackened hide, he saw pink, glistening muscles stretch and pull with the movements of its limbs. When it smiled, he saw its teeth were too big and mismatched for it. A grin of stolen dentition, Timothy smiled his yellow smile in return, as he wondered if, perhaps, he was staring at the real-life Tooth Fairy. Its nether regions were so scorched and mutilated by flames that its original gender was neither discernible nor relevant. Mercifully, this child would never grow old enough to suffer for this particular injury.
Can I tell him?
It asked in its voice, looking back at the woman Skade, with eyes as wide as any child has for a mother. Skade smiled a black smile and nodded. Her eyes were hidden under onyx, her reddish teeth and blackened gums shining in the muddy light. The child came to him and touched his mutilated shoulders, where thorn bushes and rusted nails had all dug before.
You belong to us. You have always belonged to us.
Tim looked at the man, the woman.
Would not wish Tim,
said the man, putting his hand to his wrinkled amphibian chest.
Water drowns them. It kills. I have built immunity. I have suffered trial by flood after flood. Now I am an ascetic of depravity. Where there is poison and revulsion, we revel and thrive. And so we build our strength through destruction. We have found true life, plague upon plague, rendered powerless before us. This is true life,
Skade hissed at him, slamming the end of a white staff into the floorboards. Her black lids opened with the sound of dry creaking, and he saw pride in those ageless, watery spheres.
These places love us,
said the androgynous child.
and we love them back. So they reward us with eternity.
Tim looked down at himself. His cuts were all blue or red with infection. His body was a rainbow of contamination. The invisible armies finding new battlegrounds in his flesh, blood, and muscle. And failing. Failing because of his immunity. The cycles of contagion changing him until none of the viruses and bacteria that had slain generations of men since they came down from the trees were rendered powerless, as if they were mere illusions to him.
Do you understand?
Yes. I never understood anything until now, he said, crying. He reached out and hugged the child close, its flesh cracking and falling away from wet, sticky muscle. When the little one hugged him back, it touched his open wounds and brushed off thick scabs, letting him rise to face Skade and Utnapishtim.
We are an elder, a mother, and a child. And now, we have a man.
has needed a father. Scotty has needed a husband. Utnapishtim reached a wet, wrinkled hand out to Timothy's ruined flesh. And I have needed a son. Tim smiled as Scotty and Utnapishtim embraced him. Together in obscenity, they incurred infinite fresh combinations of destruction all anew, and would do so together for the untold millennia in which they would live. Always dying, but never dead. Hi everyone. My name is Kent J. Starrett, also known as Thoughtful Devil. If you liked that story, you can find it and 9 others in my anthology, Human Resources, currently available on Amazon. I've also written Jackie and Craig, a horror novel geared at preteens, something like Stand By Me meets Gremlins, and The Star Pixie and the Serpent Queen, a picture book for children about the importance of self-respect and creative expression for dealing with traumatic life incidents. If you enjoyed this, you can reach me at kent.john.starrett@gmail.com. Link in the description. If you have any suggestions for any videos you'd like to see in the future, feel free to give them to me. And if you enjoyed this one, thank you. There will be more in the future, I promise. Remember, every day can be Halloween, as long as you think spooky thoughts. Stay thoughtful, my moonbats. Until next time, KJS, out.